This is Bob Fitrakis bringing you the other side of the news from WGRN 94.1.
Death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
Steve Rosenfeld, glad to have you on the other side of the news.
Hey, glad to be here.
Yeah, in your case, the other side of the news is the factual side of the news, which is, and again, for the record, Steve and I co-authored books following the 2004 election. And your background, you worked for Bernie Sanders, did you not, early on?
Yeah, early on after my career as a Vermont journalist, I was his press secretary on the first campaign, his first election to the House. I was the press secretary, 1990.
And you've been doing a variety of journalism since. Who are you writing for these days?
Well, I'm with a nonprofit called the Indy-Media Institute, and my stuff gets distributed throughout what I call the lefty media ghetto, which means Salon, National Memo, sometimes Daily Kos, sometimes Color of Change, a whole bunch of websites. Sometimes the LA Progressive. Oh, it goes on and on and on. I forget. Our Future, just sometimes even Ms. Magazine, interestingly enough.
Well, you've been writing a lot lately, and you've been writing about Ohio. That's why we want you on the other side of the news. What's happening? I've been reading a lot in terms of dollars. MIT saying 2 million, but probably twice that. So $4 billion to have a decent mail-in election, and how much have they actually put out? 400 million or so?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. After the pandemic hit, basically the consensus, I'm not sure you would necessarily agree with this consensus, I'm not sure I agree with it entirely either, is that people should shift to as much voting by mail as possible. So to do that, a lot of money has to be spent by election administrators, and it really varies from state to state. And it starts with the most mundane stuff like getting the paper stock and printing ballots, and then getting ballot sleeves and paying for postage on envelopes and all that sort of stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And then it gets a little more sophisticated, and it goes to, okay, now we need new scanners, which of course the vendors want to tell you, get your order in now. And then it goes from there to, all the health and public safety supplies. Like, are you going to actually wipe down these screens? And do you have enough, literally, alcohol, paper, and masks and stuff to protect poll workers? And then, so you have this whole spectrum because you need to have you need to have some form of in-person voting for people with disabilities, and from people who, at least that's sort of the logic. That is in the law, but pushing everything else to vote by mail. And what's happened, of course, and you know this, and you saw this in Ohio last week, is that the public is not used to this. And so as a result, you've got, we have a catalog of things that can go wrong, or just not work, or just break down, or create impediments and raise questions. So you have this big push on the one hand for all this money to come from the feds. The feds are not, Congress has not necessarily, they've so far given 400 million out of an estimated 4 billion. I don't know if that number is the correct estimate of what's needed, but it's certainly not enough. 1/10 is certainly not going to be enough. And then you also have the way states are running these elections and these low turnout primaries and state and local government elections right now that are showing that this shift is not going particularly well. And the biggest numbers I can point to in Ohio, and you know this better than I, is as of today, if you go to the Secretary of State's website, they still say there are 200,000 outstanding absentee ballots that have yet to be accounted for.
And that's 10% of all the ballots.
And 40,000 provisionals, which meant that people showed up, even though they were told to vote by mail, They found the one obscure location in their county, I mean, the shopping mall on the outskirts of Columbus. And somehow they demanded that I want to vote despite the pandemic. And there are 40,000 statewide of those ballots that have yet to be accounted for. So if you really think about this, you have a low turnout election, less than 25%, and you have 250,000 ballots a week after Election Day that are somehow floating around in space. They have yet to land and be counted. And you have numbers that are not quite as big as this, but there were 150,000 ballots in Wisconsin from early April that also, they never got there in time. They were disqualified. They weren't counted for a variety of reasons. These are insanely big numbers of a magnitude that is, I mean, we talk about voter suppression. It's like, peeling off 1,000 voters here, 5,000 voters there. This is a whole nother level. And this is where we are today.
And of course, there's speculation that those ballots missing don't fall evenly because the larger amount of ballots, of course, will be coming from the urban counties, which tend to vote disproportionately Democratic. And again, you've got so many ballots coming in, is just percentage-wise, they're far more likely to come up missing in the 9 urban areas of Ohio than they are in Vinton County with only 10,000 people.
Yeah, well, you know this better than I, Bob. This is not a new story, but really what's new is, and if you think about 2020, we knew this was going to be a dicey year for a whole lot of reasons before the pandemic. From my perspective, when I try to cover these days voting rights and election technology, I was looking at, well, how are all these new machines that are being tried? Like these automatic, touch screens where you touch it and it prints out a printed ballot, and then that gets scanned. That's another new machine. How that's going to work? And we saw it before the pandemic in state after state after state. Little varieties of 15%, 20% of the machines didn't start up. They didn't work. Long lines because the poll books, which are supposed to track in everyone electronically, weren't working. Just all kinds of little nickel and diming stuff that was not little if you're stuck in line for 4 hours, which was common across the country, rich and poor alike, Los Angeles, South Carolina. But since the pandemic, we're talking about not just a new machine, we're talking about a new system entirely of, how people register, get their ballots, have to fill them out, have to turn them in, how they get processed, do they get processed, when are there the results? There's the level of complexity and the possibilities of so many things going wrong is just it's a whole nother, it's like comparing Mars and Jupiter. Before the pandemic, it was Mars, but this is Jupiter. It's so big and it's everywhere that it's happened so far. And this is what's literally going on right now. And people are scrambling to try to figure out, some people are, the activists are trying to scramble to figure out what can people do? What do we do? But in the halls of Congress, you have a whole other thing of you have all this lobbying for just give us the money and we'll fix it. And the vendors will come in and make everything fine. And it'll be just wonderful. And it'll be, and you and I both know, life doesn't work that way.
Well, and also those people were elected under the current systems, and they're often reluctant to change it in whatever party they're in. We had a huge battle here in Franklin County between the progressive Democrats and burners versus the party regulars. So here it was the progressive Democrat insurgents that were complaining about their ballots not arriving, etc. But also you've got a president now that is on the record saying that low voter turnouts help the Republicans, right? That if you have everyone voting, Republicans can't win.
It's not just the president. Yeah, he's the best known. Every couple of years, it's kind of a funny thing. You look at the progressive press and people say, there's another gotcha article. Oh my God, yet another Republican official said what we know is to be true all along. that if there are high turnout elections, there's no way they can possibly win. And what we're saying is if
And polls have always shown that, right? I mean, all eligible voters, which all eligible voters don't register or vote, the Dems win.
right, I mean, so this is it's not exactly headline news, but it's treated as such. But what's different in this cycle is we've seen even more of these outbursts, and it's not just from Trump. You had one of the Trump's top campaign officials who was talking to a Republican National Lawyers Association, which is a subset of the RNC, meeting in Wisconsin, basically telling these Wisconsin donors, and this was November, that Wisconsin is the key state. It is, if Trump loses Wisconsin, he loses the election. And he basically said, he just said flat out, we are the party of voter suppression. That's what we have to do. And you can just follow this down the line to all kinds of, steps in the process that make things either harder intentionally or intentionally easier for people to vote. And in a lot of these swing states, we're seeing stuff that's harder. And we can talk about so many examples, but it's not a new landscape, but we're seeing it. We've seen it yet again.
Streaming to you from the Indy-Media studios of the Free Press Network here on YouTube, but also available online at WGRN.org. Plus, listen to us on Columbus, Ohio's 2 volunteer-run low-power FM radio stations, Fridays at 5:30 p.m. on WGRN 94.1 The Green Renaissance, and Mondays 5:30 p.m. on WCRS 92.7 and 98.3.
Now, there's no universal standard, is there, for mail-in voting? I mean, there's different approaches, different models. For example, send everyone a ballot who's registered to vote. That's not what we did in Ohio and in other states.
Well, this is really, really interesting, actually, because you're right. So the way I begin, I've tried to really familiarize myself. So what does that mean? So the most user-friendly approach is to send everyone, not an application, which is what you have in Ohio. It's a ballot. First of all, it's cheaper. Why would you waste the postage for the printing and all that stuff and add on to the bureaucratic load of election administrators who tend to be overworked anyway at these pinch points? Why would you literally double the amount of paper that's got to go before them and all the checking if you just wanted to help people vote? But right now, only 5 states do that. And most interestingly, the last state to do it was Nevada, because they have some upcoming elections later this month. And the Democratic National Committee, they had to sue, because here again, this is an example of how things are nickeled and dimed. In Nevada, the county where Las Vegas is, Clark County, is 80% of the state's electorate. Well, the Secretary of State didn't want to send what they call active voter a ballot. I mean, they wanted to send everybody. They wanted to send to active voters, but not inactive voters. And inactive means you haven't voted in the last couple of years, but you still were registered. So the Democrats had to sue, and they settled it. They made a settlement with the county registrar in Clark County, Las Vegas, because it's 80% of the state. So what will they do? They now will mail out ballots to all the voters, but on election day, instead of having one place like you just had in Columbus, they'll have 3. It's still, can you imagine Las Vegas with just 3 in-person places to go vote? And as if that is really like an effective solution, but that is being touted as a breakthrough victory in a DNC lawsuit. And this is what's going on. So this first level, what we're talking about here is send everybody a ballot. Well, it's not happening in most places. Since the pandemic broke, about 10 states have decided they will send applications. Now, Ohio was one of those states. But in Ohio, when you postponed your election, you did not extend registration. So you basically, already are segregating the electorate. You're further segregating it by those who have to fill out the application and get it back in time. Then you have this whole craziness of you got to get your ballot in time, and you got to fill it out correctly, and you got to get it back in. Now you can use the postal service, or you can have drop boxes. Well, we know what Trump is doing in the postal service, and it's pretty transparent. And so again, where we started talking a little while ago, you have 250,000 ballots that are yet been unaccounted for, as of your election more than a week ago today. Where are they? And how many will count? Well, we may know later today or tomorrow at the end of the day but I can assure you, well, what would you think, Bob? I mean, like, do you think you'll be lucky if you get half of them returned and counted?
I'm thinking at this point, they've been out so long, and you're listening or watching WGRN 94.1. Steve Rosenfeld, election integrity journalist and author, is with us. I'm thinking about, Ohio's always like a great test market, but in 2016, they sent out applications, but over 1 million people, primarily in urban areas, didn't get, 7 million people get a application to apply for a ballot, theoretically, but 1 million never get the application. So that's one model. No universal ballots are sent out. But this last time, in the primary, the party primaries, they didn't send out any ballot applications unless during the early period someone requested it. So we've actually gone backwards from having the Secretary of State send out ballot applications. I mean, people didn't know where to even get these ballots. And if you're not real good with your computer and downloading, the only place that was and it wasn't advertised by the election people, but the only thing that came on the news is go to Kroger's and go to the service desk, and you can get a ballot application there. So anytime the ballots stay out, this long, you get questions of or concerns about tampering, chain of custody, and who knows? It'll be good to see how many actually come in. And they weren't even, the 44,000 or so provisionals, they weren't even prepared to the last second. It was the Secretary of State who says, look, people have a right to go and vote in person if they've been denied or if something's wrong. A lot of those people were given the wrong party's ballot. We personally got calls here at the Free Press at our election hotline where it's like you're a Democrat, you're a Bernie supporter, you want to get out and cast the ballot symbolically, and you've got a Republican ballot, and it arrives on Saturday. Not time to get there on Monday, get a new one, and probably get it in the mail to postmark it. And even if you postmark it on Monday, those are the ballots that many of them probably still aren't in. It was said that the mail was running 10 days to 2 weeks. If there's a backlog of that, a lot of these ballots aren't going to be counted. They're coming in too late.
Yeah, so I think that if you think about this, what's being stood up in the pandemic, in terms of voting options, the means and rules of voting, what's being stood up? The easiest thing, the most user-friendly thing is sending voters a ballot. And then the next thing is sending them an application with a stamp to send it back, even though that creates more bureaucracy. Then it's not sending them anything. It's putting the burden on them to request it. And the clock is ticking. And then what happens is if you don't, this was on some of these election protection press conferences last Tuesday, if you don't request a ballot in the time before your primary and you show up, they won't count your vote because you basically, even though you are registered, you didn't request an absentee ballot, so you weren't eligible for this primary. Now, this is the kind of stuff that is crazy making. And maybe listeners will be listening to this and they'll be thinking, "Oh my God, I can't even follow this anymore." Well, this is intentional. These rules are, these are not. They weren't created by God. They were created by people
Is there any doubt in your mind that a lot of this confusion was caused intentionally?
There's no doubt, and I think that there's absolutely no doubt, because look at the stakes. And this is just I mean, again, 250,000 ballots not returned yet or unaccounted for yet in your state, Ohio. This is a low turnout election. Less than 23%. So what do you get in the fall? A good turnout is a 55 or 60% election.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
You're gonna have like double these numbers. And what's the margin going to be between Trump and Biden? Is it if it's less than
right now? It's every poll has them within 2 to 3 points. I think
right.
Biden is up by 1 point. I mean, Ohio's a swing state, all things being equal in terms of voting.
Right. So this is not just happening in Ohio. It looks like it will be happening in many places, although there are going to be variations on these themes. And this is very discouraging. And I mean, we can keep talking about this, but basically we're trying, people like myself are trying to track what's really not working so that we can try to inform people about what they need to do and when they need to do it. But there's other stuff going on in this greater universe that really has people concerned. And this is not an accident. None of this is an accident.
Is there a model system? Is the preferred system everyone who's registered to vote gets a ballot?
Yeah, but the states
drop boxes where, instead of just, one place with cops, the traffic's so backed up, even though there's a low voter turnout because there's only one place to vote in the county. The police have to come in because there's so many cars lined up.
Well, this is the thing. Yes, that you could point to, okay, the national groups that are promoting this, that are promoting let's just make a wholesale shift to absentee voting and it will be easy and we can do it. And so just give us the money. What they're not saying is that the states that they look to as models took decades to perfect this. They didn't do it in 6 months before the most consequential presidential election. So we're talking about Oregon and Washington and Colorado. And so for example, here's what you did not see in Ohio, for example, last week. These other states have software where you can track your ballot in the postal system like you can track the progress of a package from Amazon.
Sounds like a great idea.
Can you? Well, for some reason it wasn't an option in Ohio.
Well, in Ohio, I go to Franklin County, even though they went to this last minute, I mean, they literally canceled the primary in person hours before it was going to take place. The health director of the state closed down the in-person voting back in March. And then there was no advertising on the new system. In Franklin County, the 2 Republican members of the boards of election said, we need to save the taxpayers money. The Democrats said, no, let's tell people how to vote, right? How to download, where they can get an application. And then that went to the Secretary of State, and it ended up, he said, no, it's no need.
Yes.
I mean, how do you bring in a new system and you don't tell people how to vote? The old system in person, you could go on and get all these videos from the Board of Elections. You could go to demonstrations. It showed you your 2 ways of voting, the touch screen that prints one out and the other one where you vote on paper and you put it in the tabulator. But not only do we have a new system, there was no advertising explaining how in the hell it worked.
I look to human error before I look to complicated conspiracies as far as the way elections screw up. and people are not familiar. Voting is not a frequent activity. It's not like going to an ATM. It's not like going shopping. You do it very infrequently. And if you're not familiar with something, you revert to what you think you know. So people will look for polling places that are closed and don't exist. They'll wonder, why did they get a ballot? Maybe they should. They'll 40,000 people at the last minute went down, to these single, these hidden locations, one per county, and got a provisional ballot that may not count. So this lack of familiarity, and then this extends, by the way, to like, how do you fill out the paper? I mean, Bob, you were telling me that people were supposed to sign their birth date, not the day they were voting, on the outside envelope. You sign you don't sign your birth date, it's disqualified under the rules because they're trying to mash it with your registration and all that sort of stuff. But people don't know any of this. They don't know, do I put in a middle initial? Do I not put a middle initial? It goes on and on and on and on and on.
And that signature better exactly match whatever's on file. And some of these were transferred over, as you've pointed out, from the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. So, in my case, Robert Fitrakis is my signature. But when I went to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, it's Robert J. Fitrakis. So many of those get tossed out because it's not a match.
Yeah, so this is really, it's really discouraging to have to talk about stuff like this. Here we are, and this is the landscape. And people who want representative government, this is what gets in the way. And
your argument that, the conspiracy in Ohio would be strange because the voting right people, progressives, many of them, and the Secretary of State, who is a Republican, both thought everyone should get a ballot because there was a pandemic going on. The state legislature, which is gerrymandered and Republican dominated, intervened and said no in-person voting and no, you can't send people a application for a ballot.
Well, I think that you don't have to do very sophisticated things to block voter turnout. And what I mean by that is you don't have to hack anything here or program this or break into tabulators or computational software. You just have to not tell people what it is they need to do, and people will bumble. And as you'll see, tens, if not hundreds of thousands, may not get to vote.
So confusing. Well, how can people read you? We're just about out of time. Where can they go to read Steve Rosenfeld?
Well, you could go to Independent Media Institute. My stuff is there. You can go to salon.com. You could go to National Memo. It's out there.
It is. He writes. He's prolific. Thanks, Steve, for being on the other side of the news.
Thanks, Bob. I hope that was good.
Oh, it's fine. Great.
And hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh,